Here's a tough one for you. The McCann case. You don't have to give your opinion on it if you don't want to, but do you have a very strong, do you sway one way?
I've looked at footage. My personal opinion is
17 years have passed since the disappearance of 3-year-old Madeleine McCann, yet her name continues to echo in every corner of the true crime world. It is a case that refuses to fade, one that has grown into a haunting symbol of unanswered questions and enduring suspicion. Official files stretch into thousands of pages. Suspects have come and gone, but the truth remains hidden in shadows. And as the years drag on, the line between fact and speculation blurs more with every retelling. Among the many figures who have stepped into this storm, one man has become an especially provocative presence. His name is Darren Stanton, a former police officer who left the streets of Nottingham and Derby to master a far more subtle battlefield: the hidden language of human behavior. To the media and to the public, he became known as the human lie detector, a man who claimed he could see what others missed: gestures, expressions, slips of the tongue that revealed cracks beneath carefully chosen words. When Stanton turned his gaze toward the McCann interviews, the world listened. He never accused, never pointed a finger of guilt, but he did repeat one phrase that would echo louder than any headline: "Something's very wrong." For those already suspicious, these words sounded like confirmation. For defenders of the family, they felt like a cruel insinuation. And in the middle of it all, the mystery of Madeleine herself grew even more entangled. This is not simply a story of a missing child, nor only of grieving parents. It is also the story of how a single man's observations about body language lit a firestorm that divided opinion across the globe. How can a fleeting glance, a nod too slight to notice, or a single word in the past tense become evidence in the court of public opinion? And more importantly, can the body reveal what the voice refuses to admit? Before Darren Stanton ever appeared on television screens or in headlines, he was a uniformed police officer walking the streets of Nottingham and Derby. His early years in law enforcement were filled with the kinds of encounters that test a person's instincts: domestic disputes that could flare into violence without warning, suspects who swore innocence while their eyes flickered with something unspoken, and interviews where the difference between truth and lies could determine justice. It was in these tense face-to-face situations that Stanton began to notice something others overlooked. People lied with words, but their bodies often betrayed them. A suspect might calmly say, "I didn't do it," while nervously tugging at a sleeve. A victim might insist they were fine, yet their trembling hands told another story. For Stanton, this discrepancy became a fascination. Over time, fascination turned into a specialty. He left behind the beat of the streets and threw himself into studying psychology, nonverbal communication, and the fragile line where conscious speech collides with subconscious leakage. His transition was dramatic, but strangely natural. From police reports and interrogations, he moved into the broader world of behavioral analysis. The media quickly took notice. Producers saw in him not just a former officer, but someone who could translate hidden signals into plain language for the public. Television appearances followed, morning shows, crime specials, even political broadcasts. Stanton dissected the stiff composure of Rupert Murdoch during the phone hacking scandal, unraveled the fiery rhetoric of Donald Trump, and read the body language of Prince Harry on his wedding day. In each case, his commentary offered audiences what they craved: the sense that beyond polished statements and media training, a human truth still leaked through. The press branded him the human lie detector, a label both flattering and dangerous. It suggested a superhuman gift, though Stanton himself always pushed back against that myth. He insisted his craft was not magic but observation, decades of training the eye to see what most ignore. His role was never to convict or absolve, but to highlight the cracks, the dissonance, the uneasy signals that words alone could not explain. By the time he was asked to comment on the McCann case, Stanton had already built a reputation as one of Britain's most recognized experts on deception. But this case would prove different from all the others. It would draw him not just into the mystery of a missing child, but into a global debate where every gesture could be treated as evidence and every phrase could ignite a storm. At the center of Darren Stanton's work lies a single, powerful idea: incongruence. It is the moment when words travel down one path while the body veers off in another. Stanton often describes it as a fracture between the conscious and the subconscious. The voice reciting a rehearsed story, while the body leaks a different truth. Imagine a man on camera denying wrongdoing with a firm no, yet at that same instant, his head gives the slightest nod of affirmation. Or picture a woman insisting that her child is alive, but slipping unconsciously into the past tense, saying was instead of is. To the untrained ear, these moments might pass unnoticed. To Stanton, they are alarms, the small cracks that signal something deeper beneath the surface. He explains that words can be sculpted and polished. They can be coached by lawyers, refined by media advisors, or rehearsed in private until every syllable sounds convincing. But the body resists that control. It betrays fleeting signals, micro-expressions that last no longer than a blink, self-soothing gestures like touching the face or folding the arms, or even the rhythm of breathing under stress. These are what Stanton calls leakages, the subconscious revealing itself despite a conscious effort to conceal. Most of us, he argues, recognize incongruence even without knowing the term. It's that gut feeling when something doesn't add up, when a story sounds fine but leaves us unsettled. Stanton's role is to give language to that unease, to frame it not as superstition, but as human psychology at work. He also cautions against simplification. Not every nervous tic is a lie. Stress, grief, or fear can mimic deception. A trembling hand may simply reflect pressure. But when the same contradictions appear again and again, when gestures, expressions, and phrasing repeatedly clash with the spoken story, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. For Stanton, incongruence is not proof of guilt. Courts cannot convict based on a nod or a slip of tense. Yet, he insists, incongruence is a yellow flag, a sign that investigators and audiences alike should look closer. It does not answer the mystery, but it whispers that something vital is missing. And nowhere, Stanton maintains, has incongruence appeared as starkly or as persistently as in the interviews of Kate and Jerry McCann. Their case, already the most scrutinized disappearance of modern times, would become a stage where every gesture, every phrase, and every pause carried the weight of suspicion. When Darren Stanton turned his attention to the interviews of Kate and Jerry McCann, he did not look for dramatic confessions or sweeping gestures. Instead, he focused on the tiny cracks, the fleeting signals that most would miss, and what he found unsettled him. Take Jerry McCann, for example. In multiple interviews, Stanton noted moments when Jerry verbally denied something, yet his head betrayed a subtle nod. It was not a grand theatrical contradiction, but a delicate leak, words insisting no, while the body whispered yes. Stanton described these as leakages from the subconscious, the kind of slips that happen when inner truth and outward performance collide. Kate McCann's speech revealed another disturbing pattern. On several occasions, she spoke about her daughter in the past tense. Madeleine was. To most viewers, this could seem like a slip of grammar or a habit born from grief. But to Stanton, it resonated with something deeper known as linguistic leakage. In forensic linguistics, referring to a missing child as though already gone can suggest an unconscious acceptance of death, even when the conscious narrative insists on hope. Then there were the gestures. Again and again, Stanton observed pacifying behaviors, movements people unconsciously perform to soothe themselves when anxiety rises. Jerry rubbed his nose, touched his face, shifted his jaw when the questioning grew intense. Kate brought her hand to her mouth, brushed her lips with her fingers, or folded her arms tightly across her chest. These, Stanton explained, are self-comforts, the body's way of releasing pressure. The timing of these gestures struck him most. They did not appear during expressions of grief, but surfaced when the couple faced direct questions about the night Madeleine vanished. For Stanton, this was not coincidence. It was a pattern. The closer the interviewers came to the crucial details, the more their bodies screamed discomfort, even as their words stayed measured. And then came the micro-expressions, those flashes of raw emotion that ripple across the face in less than a second. One of the most striking moments occurred when Kate slipped into the past tense while speaking of Madeleine. In that instant, Stanton noticed a brief but unmistakable micro-expression of sadness, lips downturned, brows lowered, eyes narrowing in pain. It was grief, but grief expressed as though for someone already lost. To Stanton, none of these signs amounted to proof. He repeated this point over and over. Body language cannot convict. It cannot establish guilt in the eyes of the law. But he argued that the accumulation of signals, the nods that contradicted words, the pacifying gestures timed to crucial questions, the linguistic slips paired with flashes of sorrow, told a story that words alone could not. For him, the McCanns interviews were not merely conversations with the press. They were performances where the spoken narrative insisted on one truth, while the bodies of Kate and Jerry leaked another. And as Stanton himself concluded, this contradiction could not be brushed aside. It was not, in his words, about declaring them guilty. It was about recognizing that something, undeniably, was very wrong. If gestures and micro-expressions told one story, the McCanns' choice of words told another. Darren Stanton did not only scrutinize the body, he also listened closely to the language, to the subtle ways people frame their narratives. And what he heard in Kate McCann's interviews disturbed him. In one instance, Kate declared, "I want to tell my version." To most, it sounded like a defensive remark, an attempt to reclaim the narrative from journalists and critics. But Stanton flagged the wording as a linguistic red flag. A version suggests subjectivity. It implies that other versions exist, other perspectives, other possible truths. Innocent parents, Stanton argued, rarely speak in versions. They cling to absolutes. This happened. My child is missing. Please help me find her. By choosing my version, Kate seemed to distance herself from the raw reality, wrapping it instead in a crafted account. Stanton called this phenomenon distancing language. It is a psychological tool people use to protect themselves from unbearable truths or from potential blame. Distancing can appear in small shifts, a pronoun avoided, a tense that slips, or a narrative that subtly redirects focus. For Stanton, distancing language was the verbal equivalent of folded arms, a shield. Again and again, he observed the McCanns shifting the gravity of their sentences away from Madeleine and onto themselves. Kate said, "We have been slandered," Jerry said. "We have suffered unspeakable pain." In interviews ostensibly about their missing daughter, the couple returned repeatedly to we. The center of gravity was not, "She needs us, but we have been wronged." For Stanton, this was not the natural speech of devastated parents consumed by the fear of losing their child. It sounded instead like the rhetoric of individuals acutely aware of their public image, carefully positioning themselves against suspicion. He pointed to Kate McCann's book, Madeleine, as further evidence. Marketed as a mother's testimony, it often read more like a structured defense, detailing slander, accusations, and reputational damage. Madeleine herself, though present throughout, seemed at times to fade into the backdrop of her parents' ordeal. Stanton stopped short of claiming this revealed deception, but he insisted it revealed incongruence, another fracture between what one might expect from anguished parents and what was actually spoken. For him, the McCanns' reliance on distancing language was not a neutral detail. It was yet another yellow flag, another sign that the narrative and the emotions behind it were not fully aligned. The words themselves, in his view, betrayed a careful management of appearances rather than unfiltered desperation. And once audiences noticed this shift, once they counted how often we replaced she, they struggled to unhear it. What Stanton illuminated was not proof, but a troubling pattern. Words meant to protect the McCanns instead deepened public doubt, leaving many to wonder whether their language revealed more than they ever intended. For Darren Stanton, the McCann case did not exist in isolation. To understand incongruence, he always looked at patterns across different investigations, where body language had revealed hidden truths and where it had misled. Two examples became central to how he contextualized the McCanns: Chris Watts in the United States and a double murder case in India. Chris Watts' story remains one of the most chilling illustrations of incongruence Stanton has ever discussed. In 2018, Watts appeared on television pleading for the safe return of his wife and two young daughters. At first glance, he seemed calm, even cooperative. He faced cameras with steady eyes, delivered statements with composure, and presented himself as a desperate husband searching for answers. But Stanton and other behavioral experts noticed glaring contradictions. While professing anguish, Watts smiled faintly. While begging for his family's safe return, he stood with his arms casually folded, his tone strangely relaxed. The words screamed urgency, but his body whispered deceit. Days later, the mask collapsed. Watts confessed to murdering his wife and children. The incongruence, obvious in hindsight, had been the body's stubborn betrayal of a hidden truth. But Stanton also reminded audiences of the opposite danger: misinterpretation. He often cited the Indian case in which a teenage girl and a household servant were found dead in the family home. Suspicion quickly fell on the girl's mother. In televised interviews, she appeared stiff, defensive, and unexpressive. Analysts at the time flagged her body language as suspicious. Crossed arms, lack of eye contact, clipped speech. Yet later, it became clear these so-called red flags were lifelong habits, cultural traits, and personality quirks. They had nothing to do with guilt. What looked like concealment was simply the way she had always behaved. Together, these two cases became Stanton's teaching tools. Watts showed how incongruence can betray the darkest truths. The Indian mother showed how incongruence can mislead without context. Both stories tempered his analysis of the McCanns. On the one hand, the sheer volume of incongruence he observed, subtle nods, linguistic leakage, self-soothing gestures, was greater than in most innocent subjects. On the other, he acknowledged the need for caution. Trauma, cultural differences, and relentless media pressure could create behaviors that mimic deception. For Stanton, the lesson was balance. A single pacifying gesture proves nothing. A slip into the past tense might simply reflect grief. But when such signs appear repeatedly, consistently, and especially at moments when questions cut closest to the truth, they cannot be dismissed. The McCanns, he argued, displayed an unusually high frequency of such signals. Not proof, not a verdict, but abnormal enough to demand attention. When Darren Stanton's observations about the McCanns reached the public, they spread like wildfire. His words landed in a landscape already divided, where suspicion and sympathy had been clashing for years. By the time he uttered the haunting phrase, "Something's very wrong," the world was ready to seize upon it. For those who had distrusted Kate and Jerry McCann from the beginning, Stanton's analysis felt like vindication. Comment sections filled with relief. Finally, someone professional sees what we've seen all along. To them, Stanton was not just an analyst. He was the truth teller who had dared to hint at what officials refused to say. His phrases, especially that chilling refrain, became rallying cries in online forums, quoted like evidence in a trial that had never taken place in court. On the opposite side, supporters of the McCanns saw his commentary as cruel and irresponsible. They argued that Stanton had fueled conspiracy theories, that he had turned grief-stricken parents into exhibits for public entertainment. Body language isn't science, critics wrote. It's just guesswork dressed up as expertise. For them, Stanton's observations were nothing more than speculation, and by giving them a stage, the media had deepened an already unbearable tragedy. The press amplified the divide. Tabloids ran headlines that distorted Stanton's cautious words into outright insinuations. Body language expert says McCann's hiding something. Nuance vanished in the rush for sensation. His careful phrase, a warning, not a verdict, became a blunt weapon, wielded by both sides of the debate. Supporters of the McCanns dismissed the coverage as manipulative. Skeptics clung to it as validation. Out of this storm emerged three dominant theories fueled by Stanton's analysis. The first was the idea of a cover-up, that the parents were concealing something, whether negligence, knowledge of an accident, or something darker. The second theory suggested an accident, that Madeleine had died in the apartment through misadventure, perhaps a fall or an overdose, and that panic led to concealment. The third theory was more subtle, the notion of embedded confessions. Critics pointed to Kate's choice of words, her focus on we rather than she, and her repeated slips into the past, tense as subconscious admissions of a truth she dared not voice. Stanton himself had never endorsed any of these theories. He had only pointed to incongruence, but his words created fertile ground for speculation. To skeptics, they were proof. To defenders, they were poison. And to Stanton, they became a reminder of the double-edged sword he carried, the power to reveal dissonance, and the peril of how others would interpret it. As Stanton's comments continued to echo through interviews, articles, and online debates, a larger question emerged. Is body language analysis truly science, or is it a fragile art, dangerously open to interpretation? Supporters of Stanton emphasized his 2 decades of experience. They pointed to his background as a police officer, his countless hours of interrogation, and his reputation as a professional called upon by media and law enforcement alike. To them, body language was not guesswork, but a tool, an early warning system capable of exposing lies or inconsistencies before they were spoken aloud. Skeptics, however, pushed back. They argued that body language is not admissible evidence in court for a reason. It is inherently subjective. A nervous tic might signal guilt, or it might simply mean someone is under pressure. A slip into the past tense might reveal acceptance of loss, or it might just be the natural confusion of a grieving mind. Without context, they warned, such interpretations can do more harm than good. Stanton himself admitted these limitations. He repeatedly stressed that incongruence is never proof. It is a yellow flag, not a red card. He likened it to the alert of a cadaver dog, an indicator that something should be investigated further, not evidence in itself. His mantra was clear: I do not accuse, I only analyze behavior. But in the fevered atmosphere surrounding the McCann case, those cautions often went unheard. The phrase, "something's very wrong," became detached from its careful origin. To skeptics, it was a coded accusation. To supporters, it was reckless slander. In either case, the nuance was lost. The public didn't want ambiguity. They wanted certainty, and certainty is exactly what body language cannot provide. The result was a paradox. Stanton's restraint gave him credibility, yet it also made his words more powerful. Because he never accused directly, audiences assumed his caution meant he was holding back the truth. Because he never absolved the McCanns, defenders assumed he was quietly condemning them. In trying to remain neutral, Stanton became a lightning rod, his every observation amplified and distorted beyond his control. This controversy highlighted both the strength and weakness of behavioral science in the public eye. On one hand, it gave people a way to articulate their unease, to name the subtle signals they sensed but could not explain. On the other, it blurred the line between analysis and accusation, between signals and proof. And in the case of Madeleine McCann, where emotions were already raw, that line was nearly impossible to see. Beyond the controversy, Darren Stanton's work in the McCann case offers lessons that extend far beyond one family or one mystery. His observations are not just about Kate and Jerry McCann, they are about how all of us use, misuse, and interpret the language of behavior. For ordinary people, the lesson is practical. Stanton urges us to pay attention to the subtle signs in daily life, the fleeting shrug that contradicts words of confidence, the micro-expression of irritation that slips past a smile, the self-soothing gesture when a question cuts too close. These signals should never be read as absolute proof, but they can serve as early warnings, nudging us to ask deeper questions or to be cautious when trust feels fragile. In relationships, negotiations, or high-stakes conversations, noticing incongruence can be a form of protection. For the media, the lesson is about responsibility. Stanton's analysis showed how easily a careful phrase can be magnified into a headline that distorts meaning. Something's very wrong was never meant as a verdict, but in the hands of tabloids, it became one. Journalists and broadcasters must remember that body language is a lens, not a gavel. To treat it as hard evidence is to risk not only misinforming the public, but also scarring the lives of those under scrutiny. For the McCanns themselves, the lesson is darker. Their interviews, replayed endlessly, ensured that their gestures and words would live on as part of the case's mythology. Every self-touch, every slip of tense, every folded arm became as enduring in public memory as the facts of the investigation. Even if innocence is assumed, the residue of suspicion lingers because human behavior, once analyzed, can never be unseen. And for Stanton, perhaps the lesson is the most complex of all. His career has taught him that the body resists deception, that truth leaks out in ways we cannot always control, but it has also taught him that interpretation is perilous, that context matters, and that neutrality is almost impossible once a case captures the world's attention. His work is both a tool for insight and a reminder of its limits. In the end, the lesson is this: incongruence should make us pause, not convict. It should spark questions, not deliver answers. It reminds us that the human body tells stories the voice cannot, but also that those stories must be read with humility, caution, and awareness of the shadows that grief, trauma, and pressure can cast. 17 years on, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann remains one of the most haunting mysteries of our time. Despite endless investigations, shifting suspects, and volumes of official files, the truth has never been uncovered. Into that void stepped Darren Stanton, not as a detective armed with evidence, but as an interpreter of human signals. And though he never accused, never declared guilt, his words reshaped the narrative in ways that cannot be undone. Something's very wrong. With those 3 words, Stanton crystallized the unease many felt but could not name. To skeptics, it sounded like the confirmation they had waited years to hear. To supporters, it felt like a cruel stain on 2 grieving parents. And to Stanton himself, it was meant only as a warning flag, a recognition of dissonance, not a declaration of guilt. But once released into the world, the phrase took on a life of its own, echoing in headlines, forums, and debates across the globe. The legacy of Stanton's analysis is not a solved case, but a reminder of how fragile the line is between observation and judgment. It reveals the power of body language to both illuminate and mislead, to comfort and to wound. It demonstrates how, in the absence of certainty, people will cling to signals, gestures, and slips of the tongue as if they were evidence. And it underscores a deeper truth, that society hungers for resolution, even when resolution is impossible. For the McCanns, the consequence is enduring. Their faces, words, and movements have been dissected more than perhaps any parents in modern history. For Stanton, the consequence is double-edged. His credibility rests on his caution, yet that very caution made his words more potent, more open to interpretation, and more explosive. And for the public, the consequence is a question that still lingers. Can we ever trust what we see, what we hear, or even what we feel when faced with tragedy? Stanton's answer is measured. Trust the signals, but never mistake them for proof. Look for incongruence, but always weigh it with context. Madeleine's case remains unresolved, suspended between theories, suspicions, and unanswered questions. But thanks to Stanton, one truth endures. The human body, however carefully managed, has a voice of its own. It whispers in gestures, it flickers across the face, it leaks in grammar and slips of the tongue. And those whispers, unsettling, imperfect, yet impossible to ignore, ensure that this mystery will never fully fade. Because even when words are polished, even when narratives are rehearsed, the body continues to resist deception. And it leaves us with the echo of Stanton's refrain, a phrase that still chills after all these years. Something's very wrong.